This video will demonstrate the production of these segmented rings assembled from trapezoid-shaped wedges with thin spacers of a contrasting color between each of the trapezoid wedges. The trapezoid-shaped wedges were sliced on the bandsaw by tilting the bandsaw table and slicing the wedges using the Accu-Wedge and Accu-Slice system. This video is part 2 of a video series on a production of trapezoid-shaped segments and wedges to produce these trapezoid-shaped segmented discs. In part 1 of this video series, we described the slicing of these trapezoid-shaped segments on the bandsaw using the Accu-Slice and Accu-Wedge system by tilting the bandsaw table to various degrees. Depending on the degree you tilt the bandsaw table to, you get different patterns of segmented disc. In this video, I'll be going one step further and then cutting my trapezoid-shaped segments on the bandsaw at various angles and degrees, and then cutting some thin slivers of wood which will be glued between the segments. The process begins with slicing the pieces on the bandsaw, cutting these thin slivers of wood on a small table saw, gluing these up with a special jig which we developed for gluing up the segmented trapezoid-shaped pieces, and adding a top and bottom layer of a thin segmented disc of the same wood variety used to produce the thin insert spacers. So next I'm going to cut this piece of maple and put some catalog spacers. Of course, there'll be spacers on both sides. So that's maple and a catalog spacer. Now I set my system to, first of all, 105 degrees because I want more segments, and I set it to 36 segments per ring. So with this size I have about a ½ inch width, so that gives me a disc of about 6 inches in diameter, and I'm going to put a spacer in there, probably about 6½ inch diameter disc when I'm done. So we'll be cutting pieces off both of these fences. I'll cut 36 on this fence, I'll take those off, and I'll cut 36 on this fence and keep it in 2 separate piles. So I have it set here. Get my stop set. The stop works really good because it brings it back to the exact same position, so I'm always indexing on exactly the same position on my Accu-Stop. That way, if this Accu-Stop was off by even a few degrees, between here and here, it might be 1/2000 of an inch, which can affect the length of my boards. But by indexing exactly the same spot, every board is going to be exactly the same length. So again, that's 105 degrees on my angle. 36 segments per ring. I'm using a 3/4 inch wide blade, 14 teeth per inch. This video is sped up 5 times actual speed just to reduce viewing time. Notice I'm turning the maple board at 180 degrees between each piece that's sliced, and I'm pulling the sled back against the stop on the rail, pushing the board against the Accu-Stop, and then cutting the board. I cut the first 36 off on this fence, now I have to go to this fence. And to distinguish between the left and right fence, I put a double line on this now for this fence, so I'll be able to tell that these came off the second rail. And again, as I've done in the past, I have to sand the fuzzies and the burrs off these pieces. Again, using 220 grit sandpaper, really around in the corners just to get rid of those fuzzies. And now I want to keep working in this pile, keeping the 2 separate. In other words, this goes here, and this goes up here. Then I want to get to this block. This will go up here, and this will go down here. And there's the 2 finished disc and 36 segments. The next step is cutting the spacers to go between these wedges. I'm ready to cut the spacers. These will be catalog spacers going between the wedges to give me an outline. There's another way I could cut these spacers. Probably the ideal way is to get a solid block of wood like this and cut it this way. and cut thin sections. And I could do that with the Accu-Slice system quite nicely. And that would be gluing end grain to end grain. Now, if I was worried about expansion, contraction, I do that. But these pieces are going to be so small and thin, that's not an issue, I don't think. So I'm using a single strip. The end grain will be facing up, and the side grain will be facing towards the outside. So that'll work fine. So I have my system all set up here, and I'll be cutting these spacers like this. I cut one off, just a test piece already. And that'll be going on there like that. This is the top. This is my outside surface. And so that's how it's going to look. So I need to cut 72 of these. My maple blocks with the catalog spacers is all set up, ready for glue up. And I assembled the blocks in position and put a rubber band around them to get the exact dimensions so that the inner plastic disc is the exact diameter as the inside of my ring. Because that plastic inner ring is the exact diameter as the inside of my disc assembly, when I glue this up, I'll get a perfect circular ring. I plan on gluing this up in two sections because there's a lot of pieces. I have 36 maple pieces plus another 36 catalog spacers, and I'm using Type-On 3 glue, which sets up pretty quickly. So first I need to remove the rubber band. So I put my top spacer on so everything doesn't fly all over the place. And then I use some pliers to more easily grab the rubber band to remove it from the assembly. And now I can remove the top disc, and I'm ready to start gluing up the pieces. When I'm ready to start gluing up, I usually remove a number of the wedges and pieces just to get them out of the way, and then start my glue up process. And I do apply the glue to both sides of the wedges and the spacers just to make sure I have good contact. And I go ahead and glue up about half the pieces in this disc. The lines on the top of each of the wedges is a good indication to make sure I don't mess anything up during the glue up. Make sure I get the correct orientation as I'm gluing up. One other thing I forgot to mention earlier is the spacers need to be pretty much the exact size of the wedges. If they stick up or out too far, they're going to get a little bit disoriented when you do the glue up. So they should be the same exact size as the wedges. It took me about 5 minutes to apply glue to half the wedges and spacers. Then I put the plastic disc on top and applied a first rubber band to the disc to hold it in position. Then I put the screw-on clamp to hold everything nice and tight, and continue to add rubber bands. I usually put 5 or 6 rubber bands on this to make sure it clamps pretty thoroughly. The more rubber bands you put on, the more pressure you're going to get against your disc. And that center ring keeps everything nice and centered. This glue up jig works quite nicely for gluing up these trapezoid shaped pieces. This would be near impossible without a jig such as this. The pieces would just slip and slide all over the place. The center clamps hold everything in position, but to get better clamping and to make sure that the pieces all are flat against the top and bottom, I do apply some additional C-clamps. I usually apply 4 C-clamps, one around each of the sides of the system. That pulls all the pieces down nice and flat, and to make sure there's no gaps between any of the pieces and the top and bottom rings. After the system has been allowed to dry for at least 5 minutes, I remove the rubber bands, remove the top spacer and clamp, and started to glue up the remaining pieces using the same process that was used previously. After glue has been applied to the last piece, I attach the top plastic disc and then attach the rubber bands to the system as was done previously. And I usually put 5 or 6 rubber bands on this, make sure I get plenty of pressure on it. After the rubber bands are all in place, I check the alignment, make sure everything is nice and tight, and then I will apply some additional clamps to make sure that the wedges are flat against the top and bottom plates. I then allowed the glued up assembly to set for about a half an hour. I don't like to let it set up too long because if you let it set up too long, it's too hard to remove it from the jig. So about a half an hour later, I remove the clamps, remove the plastic disc, and then remove the glued up assembly from the mania of the jig. I'll stick a little bit here, but it does come off. I leave the rubber bands on, and I'll let it dry for at least 3 or 4 more hours. I have my maple and Accu-Slice trapezoid shaped ring, and there's 36 segments in this ring, and I want to make a Accu-Slice accent ring, probably 50,000 inch thick to go on the top and bottom of this ring. The diameter of this ring is 6 1/4 inches. So this is 36 segments per ring, but I'm going to make my accent strip of 18 segments. As long as my accent strip is a multiple or a division of the number of segments in a ring, I can do that. So I'm making 18 segments per ring. It's going to be 6 1/4 inches in diameter. And from my chart, it tells me my segment should be 1.10 inches wide at the widest part at the outside diameter. So I have it all set up for that dimension and ready to start cutting. I return my bandsaw blade to the horizontal position. I squared it up so the blade is square with the table. I set it to 18 segments per inch, and once again I'm using a 3/4 inch by 14 teeth per inch blade. And the width of these pieces will be 1.10 inches. Again, I put my line on my board. It's just a dark board. I use a white or a gray pen so you can see it. I have my Accu-Stop all set, and I'll be centering at the center of the disc on the Accu-Stop. Always want to try and index on the exact same position to get the most accuracy possible. Notice that I'm using both fences to cut these wedges, and the mark on the board is always facing up as I go back and forth between the two fences. After sanding those Accu-Slice segments and then assembling them to a ring and binding it with a rubber band, gives me a ring the exact same diameter as my maple and Accu-Slice ring. And so from this ring I'll be cutting some thin slices that'll go on top and bottom of this ring. I have this simple segmented ring. This is 18 segments of Accu-Slice, and I could just glue these on here one at a time like I did for the previous ones, but I actually combined this with the technique I used in previous videos several years ago, in which I put a piece of tape down here, sticky side up, put all the pieces on there, and then put the glue between the joints. And that's a lot faster way of gluing these up. You don't stand a chance of the glue setting up on one before you get the whole way around. So that's what I'm going to do for this. So let me first of all take the rubber band off of this. So it'll be a combination of my previous technique with this new technique using this new glue-up jig. Don't necessarily need the centerpiece because these are really self-aligning when they're set up. So let me put some tape down. Now this sticky side up. And I just put my pieces on here, lining over at the edge of the tape. Now I could put the glue on these first, but I can put the glue on later. I think it'll be faster. This will be a real fast way. I probably can glue these up in less than 2 minutes. Now I'm going to go and cut this excess tape off the top, so it doesn't interfere with my glue-up jig. And I just glob the glue in between all the joints. It only took like a minute to cover all of those joints. Now I'm going to go through and just go through them all again just to make sure they're fully covered. I'll wipe up the excess glue. Apply additional rubber bands. And the jig works nice because I can put rubber bands on without worrying about, you know, the thing flying up on me again. So the segments are just more secure during the clamping process. Now you could use those hose clamps. I don't like the hose clamps because where that little nipple is, it tends to push in that segment. So that's what I prefer the rubber bands because they give a nice even pressure the whole way around. I just use lots of them. The more rubber bands you put on, the more pressure you're going to get. Eventually I'll clamp this down tight. Again, that acts just like I used to do in the past where I'd go and put this in one of my presses. Well, I don't need to press now because this pushes it down, gets everything flush and, you know, down flat. As I'm going along, I just make sure that rubber bands aren't underneath the I'm now ready to cut some thin rings. In this case, from this piece of catalogs, I'll be cutting some thin rings, maybe 50,000 of an inch thick, that go on the top and bottom of this segmented disc, just to match the outline of my separating pieces in here. And I can do this in two ways. Normally I like to glue my segmented ring to a sheet of MDF and then mount it to my carriage and slice it off. And I prefer this method because I can cut all the way down to the glue line, so I can cut 100% of the wood. And I have two, you know, my catalogs and a maple disc here to do that. The other technique I can use, I made this several years ago. In fact, I did a video on it. It's a clamping system. It has two, you know, clamps here in the bottom that my ring would sit on, and then this offset cam, you know, locks it in place. And this works good if I need to cut, you know, one or two rings off of a bigger disc. The disadvantage of this system is I can't cut down the whole way. I have a 1/4 inch here I can't cut down to. But if I just want to cut off one or two rings, this is an ideal system. I don't need to glue it to, you know, a sacrificial fence. But most of the time I do glue my boards. But this is another technique that can be used, and I'll be cutting this ring on this system here shortly. So what I've done here is I've taken my board, I put it on these two rails here, tight against the fence, make sure it's tight against the fence, and then lock it in place with this offset cam. Making sure that this stays flat against the sacrificial fence. And that's held very securely. I got my gauge zeroed out, so again I do just like I do it in the past. Move my board so it just touches the piece. I want to cut off a smaller section just to give me a flat parallel surface, so I'll just cut off the minimum amount. You know, maybe less than a 1/16 of an inch piece, maybe a 32nd of an inch piece, and lock my mag jigs in place. So everything's locked in place. My course adjustment knobs, my mag jigs. I'm cutting off maybe a 32nd of an inch disc, and then afterwards I'll advance my index wheel one full turn, which is the curve of the blade, and then I want a piece, say 50,000 of an inch, which will be another revolution, so it'll be 2 revolutions. Let me go and cut this first piece. You see how thin that first piece of scrap was that came off of there. So now I advance I open my mag jigs. 50 thousandths is my curve for my blade. Another 50 thousandths will give me a thin disc, 50 thousandths of an inch thick. Lock the mag jigs in place and then cut as normal. Now my blade, again, this is an 8 teeth per inch. I could use either an 8 or a 10 teeth per inch. I decided to use an 8, but I'm cutting very slowly, so I'm getting a pretty smooth cut. So it's a 1/2 inch wide blade, 8 teeth per inch. And I do have my blade guides way up because my sacrificial fence is so high in this case. So from that disc I was able to cut 4 pieces 100,000 of an inch thick, because I want a little bit thicker pieces, and I cut 2 pieces 50,000 of an inch thick. But as you can see, that's pretty much it. I have like a little over a 1/4 inch thick piece of wood left, but I can't cut any more, otherwise I'd be cutting into my clamp. I have my catalog spring, which is glued to this sacrificial fence, and I know I want some 50,000 inch thick spacers, because they're going to be the top and bottom of these, and these are about 45,000 of an inch thick. So I want something similar in thickness to go on top and bottom. So I'm going to cut a bunch of these 50 thousandths, and I'll try and go the whole way down to the very end, see how many I can get out. So the first one will just be a cut off to give me a square surface. Same blade, 1/2 inch blade, 8 teeth per inch. Okay, from the 1 segmented disc I was able to cut 7 segment discs, each of these 50 thousandths of an inch thick. And I have about 20 thousandths left. So I cut almost down to the glue joint. I could do not enough to cut another piece, just about less than the thickness of the blade left there. So my plan is to take 2 of these and put one on the top and one on the bottom. Again, this matches my separating lines. And then I have some maple disc, which are 100 thousandths of an inch thick. I'll put one on the top, one on the bottom, and that's what my piece will look like. Okay, after the glue dries, these need to be cleaned up. Sand the face off so it's get rid of the glue marks, and the surface isn't has a lot of bumps in it, so it needs to be sanded ground too. And I could sand the inside if I wanted to also, but it's not really necessary. So I use my edge sander. Yeah, I did go and sand the insides also on my drum sander, and then dusted them off, so that's the resulting pattern. And if I stack these together, I could do patterns such as that. I'm ready to glue up my layers to this trapezoid segment. I'm actually going to put 2 layers. I'm going to put a catalogs first, and then, which is 50 thousandths of an inch thick. Then I have a 100 thousandths inch thick maple ring. So that's how it's going to look. Normally when I glue these on, I'd use my press. And with the press I see a lot of slipping and sliding of this as they're gluing up. And I think I can get this much better on here since I have one central piece clamping down. I don't think it'll slip and slide near as much. So I put a center disc in here just to give me something a little closer. It's pretty close, it doesn't have to be perfect. And so I'll be gluing this on, and again making sure I stagger the joints in the segments. They're pretty hard to see in here, but I can see them. So that's how they'll go in there like that. So I'll just do one at a time. I don't think I can do two at once. I think I'll just have to do one at a time. Just want to make sure they don't slip and slide all over the place on me. So let me go ahead and glue this up. Okay, I want to make sure I stagger my joints, because that'll make it much stronger. Okay, I'm just watching for movement, see if it moves at all as I tighten it. It doesn't look like it's moving at all. That looks really good. I think because I have a central pressure point pulling out evenly, not extra mass, and I know it's not off center, I think that's why it's working much better. I then glue on the maple second ring in the same manner. And then I repeat the same process to glue the other two rings on the opposite side of the segmented trapezoid disc. This is the series of trapezoid-shaped wedges that were made into segmented discs for this video. And I made a number of different styles for this video. The first one I made was this purple heart with maple spacings and a maple top and bottom ring. Next I made two of these maple with Cadillac spacings and then top and bottom rings. These are slightly different. One has double rings, one has actually 4 rings. And then I made 6 of these cherry with red heart spacings and red heart top and bottom rings. And I took 2 of these each and I combined them together to make these double layer rings, again with red heart spacers and red heart top and bottom and a spacer between the 2 layers. And the last one I made with these yellow heart with Paduk spacers. And I didn't put any top and bottom rings on these because I plan on using these in the next video, which is on making some of the Southwest pattern designs. So that'll be in the next video. Let me put each of these on the turntable and we'll get a good shot of each of them. This first trapezoid segmented disc consists of 36 maple wedges cut at an angle of 105 degrees with Cadillac spacers. A single Cadillac and maple accent ring was then added to both the top and bottom. The second trapezoid segmented disc again contains 36 maple wedges cut at an angle of 105 degrees with Cadillac spacers. However, I added double accent rings of Cadillac and maple to the top and bottom. These next trapezoid segmented discs contain 36 cherry wedges cut at an angle of 105 degrees with red heart spacers, to which I added a single accent ring of red heart to the top and bottom. For this next trapezoid segmented disc, I combined 2 of the cherry and red heart discs described previously and glued them together to produce a stacked pattern with a red heart spacer between the 2 layers. I also added a single accent ring of red heart to the top and bottom. This trapezoid segmented disc consists of 18 yellow heart wedges cut at an angle of 110 degrees with Paduk spacers. This final trapezoid segmented disc consists of 18 Purple Heart wedges cut at an angle 105 degrees with maple spacers. A single maple accent ring was then added to both the top and bottom. This completes part 2 of this video series on trapezoid segmented disc. In part 1 of this video series, we described the production of the trapezoid segmented wedges on the bandsaw. In this part 2, we described the production of more complex trapezoid segmented discs with contrasting spacers between each of the segments. In part 3 of this video series, which will follow shortly, we will describe the production of some southwestern Indian pattern discs using these trapezoid segmented discs. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, please give us a call or drop us an email. We'd be glad to talk with you.